Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are calling us from. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Liz Zavodsky. I'm currently the executive director of Ecochallenge.org. And I can't thank you enough for participating in our Earth Month Eco Challenge this year, for taking actions in your own life, for being inspired to care about the planet. We really, really appreciate it. And we congratulate you on all of the actions you have taken and all of the impact you have made. If you have not yet formally joined the Earth Month Eco Challenge, there is still time to do that. We go through April 30th, and a lot of impact and a lot of action can be made in 1 week's time. So you are welcome to still join us for the days ahead. And if you have participated, you can still go back and log your actions that you've taken and just think about all the impact that you've made, all of the change that you might have created in your own life and your community. So thank you for making a difference in who you are and the decisions you make every single day. If you are new to ecochallenge.org and our programs, I just want to give you a little bit of a background before we turn it over for our panelists in this really incredible topic that we're talking about today. Ecochallenge.org has been around since 1993, and we are trying to help people make change in their life. We are trying to help people take action, create new habits, and really make change possible in your own community and for you personally as well that can impact the planet on a positive scale. We do that through our Eco Challenge platform, like Earth Month, and this has been going on since 2017 was our first Earth Month Eco Challenge. We also have an Eco Challenge in October every year. And we thought it was a really good way to bring people together. Everyone's taking action during this month anyway, so we wanted to see what are people doing? Can we offer new actions to suggest that might make a difference in your life? And so we've been doing this year after year. We also have our discussion courses, which are really powerful books that have a lot of different perspectives on the environment and sustainability and ways that we can also take additional action. So through our two programs, our Eco Challenge program and our discussion course books, we really try to provide resources and bring people together, hearing different perspectives, and knowing different ways that we can actually make a difference on this planet that we all share together. So we're glad you're here. We hope you want to learn more about us and dive in more with our programs. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Lauren, Dr. Lauren Watkins on our team. Thank you so much for putting this together today and bringing such a powerful panelist group together.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And it's so great to be with all of you today. Thank you for spending some of your Earth Week to join us as we explore our topic, which is resilience. And again, my name is Lauren. I'm an environmental psychologist and I manage our programs here at ecochallenge.org and help set up events like this so we can hear from thought leaders on various topics each year. And I'm so excited to introduce you to some of them in just a moment. But first, I wanted to share a little bit about why we chose resilience as our theme this year. It keeps, I don't know about for all of you, but I feel like it keeps showing up everywhere and it's in conversations about ourselves, communities, the environment, systems at every level. And the more that I'm hearing about it, the more it's getting a little fuzzy for me. So I wanted to bring people together to understand what it really means, kind of slow down and look at what that word is and the essence of the through the lens of three experts. So we're going to explore that together today, and I'm excited. They're going to introduce themselves much better than I know I could. But I'm joined today by Dr. Tanoia Thompson, who looks at resilience through the lens of organizations and leadership. Dr. Heather Littleton approaches it through as a psychologist who studies how individuals navigate trauma and stress. And then Dr. Kenneth Rayner brings us to the ecosystem and community view and level. So we're covering a lot of different layers there as we explore today. And I think they're going to show us that resilience is a lot more dynamic than we might often assume. So we're going to just go ahead and get started. You don't need to hear from me. We want to hear from them. And I'd love for you, I'll call on you as we go along. I'd love for you to introduce yourself and then take a couple minutes to share maybe a brief memory of a time that you saw resilience in action. So Tanoia, we'll start with you.
Hi, everyone. So great to be here and super excited for this conversation. My name is Tanoy Thompson. I work as a consultant and a senior strategist, one with my own company, WildSpark Consulting, as well as with Canopy Strategic Partners. I was born and raised in the Bahamas, so got to grow up in a pretty beautiful place. And I live in Houston, Texas, and both of those places have hurricanes pretty often. And so I think the moment that I'd love to share today is in 2008, we had a pretty big storm called Hurricane Ike. And I was living on Galveston Island at the time. I was working at the aquarium, and it was a pretty big storm that caused a lot of severe damage. And then working around the clock, watching the first responders, us as animal caretakers, people with, their homes devastated and things, but just seeing the community come together and just continue to push forward each day. And then watching the encouragement, it really built a resilient community for Galveston and the Galveston area at large because everyone came together. People came from all over. And so I always think of that moment and many other hurricane moments where people come together really quickly and build that resilience by lifting each other up in a hard time. And so that's what I'd love to share today.
Thank you, Tony. That really resonates with me because, as you know, we go way back. I live in Florida, also hurricane prone. So we hear that word a lot in my town too, and have seen the way communities come together. So thank you for sharing that. All right, we'll go ahead and go over to you, Kenneth.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lauren. And yeah, I actually grew up an hour north of Houston. So yeah, I'm very familiar with the hurricanes. Hi, everyone. My name is Kenneth Rayner. Uh, I operate Panarchy Consulting. Right now I consult with the Climate Smart Communities Initiative and the Climate Ready Workforce through NOAA. And uh, yeah, so seeing it in action, I really resonate with what's been said so far. Like the reason I really got into the concept around resilience, and actually that was my entire PhD was around social ecological resilience, was I used to work for the National Estuarine Research Reserve and as an environmental educator, and we were tasked with building and fostering resilience. And I was always like, what does that mean? What am I supposed to do to check that box? Like, how do I make that happen? And um, we didn't really have a clear pathway on that. And that's what I wanted to understand in my PhD. And so when I started my PhD, I better understood that, oh, I'm seeing it constantly, especially through the work that we did as environmental educators, where, like, for example, we would have students growing smooth cordgrass in their hydroponic systems at school. And then they would come and plant that out at the reserve to restore a degraded shoreline. And watching that degraded shoreline transform back into the system that it once was, while also seeing how that effort transformed the students and teachers. To me, that was me seeing resilience in action. So, yeah,
Great. Thank you
thank
for
you.
sharing. And over to you, Dr. Littleton.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for having me here today. And thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Heather Littleton. I'm the Director of Research Operations at the Lyda Hill Institute for Human Resilience at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And I'm also Professor of Psychology. As Lauren alluded to earlier, my work is really understanding how individuals recover from highly stressful and traumatic experiences, especially interpersonal violence experiences, but also more broadly. I've also done research with mass shooting survivors, hurricane survivors, and so on, as well as developing interventions that can be delivered to prevent trauma experiences and help people recover from trauma, especially using technology. So using webinars, right? Using Zoom, using online interventions so that we can really get those interventions to folks who need them. Um, didn't plan this, but when I got the prompt of like a personal experience of resilience, I actually was thinking about a study I did with hurricane survivors in rural North Carolina after Hurricane Florence. And that hurricane really devastated the whole eastern coast, like the southeastern coast of North Carolina. And we were wanting to sort of understand adjustment among rural hurricane survivors. So in those rural communities that frankly were just abandoned after the hurricane, while a lot of resources went to Wilmington and more urban areas, areas where people like to go on vacation. These rural communities really found themselves, left with to recover on their own, having to navigate all kinds of challenges. We had folks in our study that were living in homes that were full of mold, that didn't have electricity, who had lost their jobs because their car was flooded and then they couldn't get to work, so they were fired. Just one, stacking on adversity after adversity and challenges after challenges. Another thing that happened in this community was that these speculators came in and bought up a lot of the land, especially land that was mobile home communities. It was a very low income area. A lot of folks lived in these mobile home parks where they would own their mobile home, but then they would pay rent on the land that the home was sitting on. And so these companies came in, bought up this land, right? Because people were motivated to sell because it had just flooded, and it had flooded 2 years earlier, another hurricane, and they jacked up the rent 2 times, 3 times. So folks were now left with not knowing what to do and at risk of being homeless because they couldn't afford the rent and they couldn't afford to move their mobile home somewhere else. And between the survivors experiencing this and work being done by legal aid attorneys in the area, this situation got publicized, and it was featured in a lot of national media, and including Time magazine. And I happened to look at this Time magazine, and I see one of my research participants, being featured in the magazine, and she was talking about, how, she just was not going to take this, and that she was standing up, that she was refusing to pay the additional rent, she was refusing to move, she was working with legal aid. And I just was really just overwhelmed by, their ability to face such severe adversity with such personal strength. And, rather than feeling despair, but just continue to be like, no, this is unjust, and I'm going to fight this injustice, and I'm not going to allow it to continue, and I'm not going to be intimidated.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, Dr. Littleton. It's, we're seeing a through line of, right, of all of what we've heard so far from our amazing experts of natural disasters. And I know that we hear about, for me, that word resilience a lot in the context of natural disasters. But I want to kind of zoom in as a psychologist myself too. Wordsmithing is important. And I want to start with you, Heather. We are hearing this word resilience and resilient a lot. When psychologists use this word, what does it actually mean? And what might we be misunderstanding or getting wrong about it when we talk about resilience?
That's an excellent question. So actually, the problem is that we don't have an agreed upon definition of what we mean by resilience. So when folks talk about resilience, they might be saying, meaning very different things. So some folks might be saying, oh, well, this person isn't experiencing distress, right? They had something really awful happen to them. They're experiencing a really significant stressor or trauma, and they seem to not be depressed or anxious, so they must be resilient. Well, that doesn't really tell us like what's going on with them. And that isn't necessarily the only evidence that someone's resilient, right? Just because you're not distressed doesn't mean you're not struggling. And just because you're experiencing distress doesn't mean you're not resilient. And so some other folks have been like, wait, we have to move beyond that. Maybe resilience is like having these personal qualities, right? So having these particular values, beliefs, personal strengths. And yes, that's probably part of the package, right? If something bad happens to you, and before it happens, you have a lot of personal strengths, maybe good coping skills, good social support, that might make it more likely that you're able to sort of, respond well to that event. But it's, again, probably only part of the picture, right? Just because we have a lot of personal strengths or quality doesn't mean that we're going to be able to handle any challenge that's thrown at us, right? We all have a point where maybe things get to be too much. So at our institute, we're really thinking of resilience, and we're not alone in doing this, as this dynamic process. It's folks who are experiencing adversity, and despite experiencing adversity, are still doing the things that they need to do, the things that are important to them. So they're working, they're taking care of their families, they're engaging with their communities, they're doing things that that are meaningful for them. And they might be experiencing distress, right? So despite experiencing that stress, despite experiencing those challenges, they're still able to respond adaptively. And that's really what we're wanting to figure out at our institute is like, how are folks doing that? What are the things that enable them to continue to adaptively respond, even though they might be experiencing a lot of adversity, even though they might be, having a difficult time, but they're still getting up, doing what they need to do. And most importantly, they still feel capable, right? They still feel like I'm experiencing a lot of challenges, but I know that I have the ability to manage them both in myself and then in the community that I have supporting me.
Oh, that resonates. I had to take a deep breath. I could feel that in my chest of like times that I've felt a lot of what you said, and many of y'all on our webinar today might resonate with you too. Thank you for sharing that and helping us get a peek into what it means at the individual level. Now we're gonna zoom out a little bit, and I want to hear from you, Kenneth. How does what Dr. Littleton just shared kind of compare to how we think about resilience at this ecosystem and community level, which I think you used the phrase, I might be getting this wrong, the socio-ecological level, or please correct me if I got that incorrect.
Oh, no, it's all good. And thank you. Yeah, I think listening to Heather, I mean, something that really resonates with me around resilience and my fascination with it is the systemic nature of resilience and how it is all about systems and interconnectedness and systems within systems. I nerd out about all of that stuff. And so it's another thing that resonated with me that I was very fascinated with when I was getting my PhD is our program was nested within the School of Nature, or oh my gosh, I'm blanking on it, but it was the environmental school. And we only had one resilience course, and it was focused on forest resilience. And so it's very ecological based of how ecological systems build, well, they're not intentional about it, right? But how they have resilience built within them. And I actually had to go to an external school to get that social component. And it was, which then brought me to this concept around psychosocial ecological resilience, which takes you from the individual, what's happening, like with what I believe Dr. Littleton was talking about with the individual, and then how is that expressed through the family, through the community, through the organization, through the institution, then through the ecosystems, and all the interconnections there. And sorry, I was just reflecting on what was going through my mind when I was hearing that. And so I'm sorry, Lauren, I lost the thread of the
No, you're great. Before I rethread us, it was the School of Forest Resources and Conservation, but it changed names, so I can't remember this name of the school either, so it's okay.
Thank
I
you.
was just wondering how you think about and define resilience in the ecosystem community level.
Sure. So I think it's not perfectly a rinse and repeat for the individual necessarily, but it's very similar. I mean, it's all about I, doing some research before this one just to refresh my mind. I mean, I have a document that's like just 3 pages of just resilience definitions. That's all it is because there's so many of them out there and so many different lenses of resilience. And for me, one that resonates with me talks about dealing with the disturbance without permanently losing your function, structure, or identity. And I think what I love about it is it applies to multiple systems, including the environment, including our social systems. So that's one thing I think it just all ties together. So I wouldn't say there's a difference in what Dr. Littleton was saying. I think it's just broadening that scale of, well, the scale, I guess.
That was such a powerful quote. I want to make sure I get this right. You said, I'm going to put this in the chat box for everyone, dealing with disturbance without losing your structure, function, or identity. Do I have that correct?
Without permanently losing it,
Permanently.
yeah.
Okay.
Your function, structure, or identity. And identity, yeah.
I might be spelling things wrong as I try to transcribe. Sorry, everyone. We're all in this together. But I really like that quote about, kind of thinking about that. So thank you for that, Dr. Rayner. And Dr. Thompson, I'd love to go to you to hear how you think about it at organizational level because of your expertise in organizational leadership. And before you answer, I just want to let everyone know if you haven't seen in the chat, if you have any questions at all, use the Q&A function and I will weave those in as we go along. All right, Tanoy, let's go.
Awesome. Well, talking about nerding out, I'm like, my brain is just going. I love this conversation so much. So I have grown up in the conservation environmental education space. And when I started my PhD, I wanted to explore organizational leadership because my thought was, I love the work that I was doing. I love the people that I work with, but how can I better support organizations in their mission-driven work? And so I zoomed in very, very acutely to organizational leadership, and then we branched out into all of these aspects. So teamwork dynamics and followership and leadership theories. And along the way, as I was thinking through my research topic, organizational culture came up a ton, as well as turnover is something that we talk about in our organizations as well. And so I wanted to understand the relationship between organizational culture and turnover intentions. Well, fast forward through my work and getting my data and looking at everything, as I looked at the data and started to interpret, I was starting to see these veins of the general systems theory, right? So in biology, we talk about our, parts and roles, these becoming connected, so interconnected. We talk about how they're learning and communicating with each other. We talk about those feedback loops and how things are learned and then the system broadens, right? So much of what we've heard so far. And so when I looked at organizational culture, I threw on this ecosystems metaphorical lens. Organizations are living systems, right? And we have people that are dynamic and shifting and changing, and there's external pressures, there's internal pressures. And so when we look at organizations, specifically in our space, looking at it through that ecosystems lens not only brings relevance to understanding organizational culture and how important it is to build resilience in an organization, but it also gives this framing that helps leaders to really understand why it's important because we're so focused on these external amazing missions and big, wicked biodiversity challenges. And so as I think about organizations, I see so much similarity in the work that Dr. Rayner has done, Dr. Littleton has done at that individual level, that community level, and that organization level, because that ecosystems metaphor and that approach is exactly what organizational culture is. And so as we think about the health of our organizations and wanting to do better work, we have to think about what does resilience mean in the context of an organization? How do we build up so that when external threats are coming, we might get to that ceiling as an organization, but we hold our identity, going back to what Dr. Rayner said about not permanently losing that organizational identity to stay on mission. So how do we do that? And that was part of the discussion and thought process of my PhD research and where it continues to go in my consulting work.
Awesome. Thank you. And there's so many through lines that I'm hearing about identity threat and overcoming things that are coming our way. And we also have a question in the Q&A that tees up perfectly what we were going to talk about next anyway. So if resilience isn't just a personality trait or an organizational trait or something that we're born with and something you just have, from the audience, we would love to hear more about how to make ourselves more resilient. What actually helps resilience grow? And I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Littleton, again. How do we do that personally at the individual level? Any tips?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to put in a plug for our GRIT program. So our GRIT program at our institute, which stands for the Greater Resilience Toolkit, it was actually developed during the COVID pandemic in response to, wow, we have a global threat to resilience, right? To our functioning, to our connections to the community. And the GRIT program is really designed to help you learn how to build those skills, right? To build those strengths, to build those connections, in your community, in your organization, et cetera, to make it more likely that you'll sort of be prepared, right, in response to a threat and be able to respond with resilience. And what's nice about the GRIT program is you can do it online on your own. We have GRIT Live where you do it in like a Zoom meeting like this. We also now have specialized GRIT programs for educators, for healthcare workers, for teens, for first responders, right? So sort of targeting groups who might, through their occupational right choice, be confronted with a lot of threats to their resilient responding. So I just wanted to put a plug in for that. I think we think about resilience, right? I mentioned, right, it's more than just personal strengths, but that's a component to it. So the more that we're able to, in our lives, engage with things that make us feel capable, that make us feel strong, empowered, confident, the more likely we are when we experience, right, some sort of challenge outside of that, that we'll also feel like, hey, I'm a strong, capable person. I can do hard things, right? And then I can do those in this novel context. In fact, I have a student in my lab who was looking at interpersonal violence survivors who engage in combat sports, right? And one thing we were finding is that for so many of these folks, that it was like engaging in combat sports, doing this thing that was really hard, really challenging, really like resembled their trauma in a lot of ways, right? Someone attacking them, someone standing over them, enable them to feel more empowered to respond to their trauma experience directly. Like, I can do this hard thing. I'm a strong person. I can respond well in stressful situations, so I can in this one as well. Another thing that we can do is really build our sense of self-compassion. So learning to treat ourselves with more kindness rather than being overly critical of ourselves. If you think about, when we experience adversity, there's going to be tough moments. There's going to be moments where you feel like, well, maybe I'm not up to this, or maybe I'm not doing as well as I can. Maybe I'm not like being as attentive to my kids as I want. Maybe I'm not doing as well at work. Maybe I'm not, you know, performing the way I'm used to performing, right? And being able to say, like, hey, you're doing the best you can, right? You're only human. I think it's really critical in enabling us to respond to resilience, to not sort of get caught in that spiral of feeling overwhelmed or feeling down on ourselves. Related to self-compassion is this idea of mindfulness too. So being able to just experience our emotions without feeling overwhelmed by them, right? Because of course, when we experience adversity, right, there's going to be a lot of really strong emotions that go with it. And so being able to like have that distance to be like, okay, I'm feeling this way, but those feelings aren't going to last forever. These feelings aren't going to overwhelm me. I can manage them. I can handle them. So those are things I think we can do. The other piece of grit is forming connections with other people, forming connections with our community. So because, right, as we've heard, right, we're not just individuals, we're embedded in our communities, in our organizations, right? So being able to have those connections, being able to help each other when we're experiencing adversity is really critical.
Amazing. Thank you for those tips. I've also transcribed those in the chat box for folks. I put the link for grit in there too for everyone. So be sure to check those out. Those are incredible tips. Tanoya, I want to hear from you on the organizational level. So we do have a question in the chat that everyone in the chat is just perfectly teeing up our conversation flow. So thank you for that. When we think about organizations, how can we build resilience? And the question from the audience is, how do we get leaders in organizations to talk about resilience with their teams, with a focus on how valuable it can be for increasing retention?
That's a great question. So I think a lot about Dr. Tasha Urich. She's doing a lot around, or she has done a lot around self-awareness, and she's also digging into resilience as well. But she has a quote that says, if you don't know it, you can't grow it. And that was one of the things that I found in my PhD research as well. I think, especially at the organizational level, it's really hard to sort of capture and understand culture, right? We often think about organizational culture, or in the way that I've sort of branded it, eco-culture, as this sort of arbitrary, surface level thing. But if we look at it as an iceberg, the top of it is obviously what people see. That's what people can identify. So very easy for them to pinpoint, this is our culture because we see these things happening within our organization. The deeper layers, it's what you say, right? It's your mission, your vision, your values that you talk about, your shared language. But often the time that the thing that gets sort of pulled out of the mix is the underlying assumptions or beliefs. So that's the bottom of the iceberg that people can't see. So when we think about organizations, we have to look at it from this deeper perspective. And so understanding it through diagnosis is something that I found is really, really helpful. The tool that I used in my PhD research is called the OCI by Cameron and Quinn. That's the Organizational Culture Assessment Instrument. And it measures 6 dimensions of organizational culture. And it essentially looks at the competing values between those 4 dominant culture types. So a creative culture, a collaborative culture, a control culture, and a competitive culture. So where I see those similarities in what everyone's saying is if we were to look at it from the ecosystems approach, it's the same sort of thing. And I branded it as, an innovative culture is rainforest, a collaborative culture is coral reef, a desert culture is more control, hierarchy, and then a competitive culture is the savanna. So bringing in my conservation background with organizational leadership to understand culture, to sort of think through what does this mean when we say we want to be a resilient organization? What does this mean when, we know that we might need to fix something within our organization, but we don't quite know what it is? So diagnosing it, just like we would an environmental impact assessment, to understand what we need to do in that environment to build the health of that ecosystem. It's the same for organizations and organizational leaders, finding some sort of diagnosis. So building the ecoculture assessment, which I'm working on right now, that's my current research, to use in the conservation context, we can then really pinpoint within those 6 dimensions of culture, leadership, management of employees, criteria for success. We can really pinpoint the dimensions that are off and try to close that gap because like Dr. Littleton says, it's this sort of tension between balance and unbalance. It's, you're getting to the ceiling, but you stop, you take a breath, you reflect, and then you keep moving forward. And so in an organization, how do you play with those tensions? Because they're all needed to find that equilibrium. But you got to diagnose it and understand it first so that you can start having the conversations, that you can build in the tactics to help that organizational culture shift or change. And so it's the same thing that we do within ecosystems, and we see happening naturally in ecosystems. We see happening naturally in some people that builds that understanding of how we can acutely measure where our organizational culture is to build resilience in that organization setting.
Thanks, Denoy. So I'm hearing that, to explore, you have to diagnose the problem first. And do you have any tips for how to motivate a leader in an organization to start these or to, I think, to the point of our anonymous attendees question, how do we, how would someone who's not a leader influence a system like this if it begins with diagnosing something collaboratively?
For sure. That's hard, right? Because it is anchored in the leadership. And so definitely getting leadership on board to understand, if we don't really understand this, we can't grow in the right direction. We can't understand where our tensions are. And I think, it comes down to having some healthy conversations and navigating your followership a little bit. That was an area that I never even thought about when I was exploring leadership theories, but followership is reversing the lens of leadership, right? And so just like you want to build and develop yourself and your leadership, you also want to build and develop your followership. And so, that means being able to stand up to, but also stand up for your leader and understanding where to have those questions and that healthy conflict. And we recognize that within the organizational setting, sometimes that's not achievable. And that's usually when people then turn over, right? Which is why I explored turnover intentions to understand that decision making. And so I think it's always important to navigate where you're at in the organization and then to start having those conversations, recognizing that they might be received or they might not, but ultimately framing it in a way that the leader understands that, hey, this not only helps what we do outside, but if we can stabilize and find resilience inside the organization, we can better navigate those threats and pressures. We can better, shift and adapt where needed. We can better serve our community. We can better meet our conservation goals. We can better everything. And so I think it's maybe rebranding and reframing that conversation a little bit.
Thank you. Good tips all around for sure. And we talked a little bit about ideas for exploring resilience at organization levels or thinking about ways that we can build it within ourselves. One of the things that helps me process a new concept or explore something is to figure out how do we undermine it or what could hinder it, right? So I'm curious, we talked about how to build it, but what should we be looking out for? Dr. Rayner, we'll go with you first, especially at the community level or the ecosystem level. What can hold us back from being resilient communities and ecosystems?
Sure, thank you. Well, I want to reflect on what was said so far too, because ultimately it's the reverse of what's been said at this point. But I like, for example, with Dr. Littleton, to me, what resonated was giving yourself grace, which means checking in with yourself. And to me, the way that translates up in the systems is through evaluations and assessments. And so by not evaluating, not assessing, not documenting what's worked and what hasn't worked, then you are undermining the capacity for resilience. That's one one aspect of it. Um, I loved the concept that Dr. Thomas brought up around, to me, it made me think of systems within systems. So within organizations, you have systems that are helping operate that larger system. One of my chapters in my PhD examined institutional resilience, another resilience to put out there, which is that broader scale that's governing those organizations. And I examined how COVID-19 impacted an environmental education institutional system. And one of the things that I was able to document what kept that system operating through COVID, because what hindered it was that the majority of their programs were in-person programs because it's environmental education, right? So and with that ceasing to exist, I mean, that was a huge disturbance to that system. And so, but they maintained operations throughout all of that. And one of the big concepts was that they had documented in a network kind of capacity of what worked and what didn't. And then they stayed in constant communication with one another throughout that whole process. And to get to dive deeper into your question is I love that we all have our frameworks. One of the frameworks that I leaned on heavily throughout my PhD was from Biggs, Schluter, and Schoon's. They have 7 principles around building resilience, sustaining ecosystem services and social ecological systems. Um, and so just really quickly, some of those are like maintaining diversity and redundancy. So if you want to hinder resilience, then you homogenize everything and you get rid of redundancies. So you get rid of your backup systems, things like that. To build resilience, you want to manage connectivity. And to hinder resilience, you would want to limit connectivity and this is what I love about, to me, it just feels so natural, this concept of resilience, because too much is also a bad thing. So you don't want too much connectivity because, for example, if you have a system that's super connected and you have a virus hit it, then that virus is going to spread very fast and very far. So yeah, and then there's 5 other principles that are around that, but it really is just essentially to hinder resilience is doing the opposite of those things. So trying to like also treating systems like a machine, like we can control it, that we know everything about it, we can make predictions about it. That is not what systems are. Systems, we can do the best that we can, but systems change is constantly happening. And so managing that constant change and being aware that that constant change is occurring, but then you have those shocks and disturbances. And it's just being prepared for those things and not maintaining your rigidity. I think that's what I was trying to get at, is maintaining your rigidity within it. Because too rigid of a system does not allow for that
Mm.
flexibility that's needed for adaptability. And I wanted another thing too is just to be mindful of is that we talk about maintaining resilience in this. Trying to think of the best way to say this, but like this positive atmosphere. But systems that we don't want can also be very resilient.
Mm.
And so being mindful that resilience can have this positive connotation, but it can also have this negative connotation, and just being mindful of how there are systems that we do want can be resilient, systems that we don't want can also be very resilient as well. So thinking about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, thinking about like a monoculture not necessarily being resilient, negative systems being more resilient than we would like sometimes. They just get ingrained. Yeah, lots to think about here. And I'd like to zoom back into the personal level. Now, with you, Dr. Littleton, what are some things that can hinder our personal resilience or
You know,
undermine
something
it?
that yeah, something that we kind of talked about earlier, right, is folks getting we kind of think about resilience, right? And resilience can change in a not linear fashion, right? So that we can get to this tipping point, or get really close to that tipping point. And we probably can all think about, right, times in our lives where maybe we got to that tipping point or really close to it, where you just feel like it's all too much. I just can't handle it, right? And that's what we really think is what brings people to that tipping point is when they undermine that sense of what we call self-efficacy, that sense that I don't have the personal coping abilities, resources, community, social resources to manage, right, what I'm experiencing. So if you think about, undermining resilience of getting to that tipping point, anything that brings us closer to that, right, is what's going to undermine resilience. So that could be the stressors just keep piling up. There's just one more thing after another, right? So if you think about, if we go back to that hurricane example, the hurricane happens, right? And there's the immediate losses, but then there's other stressors that can pile up. So we saw that in our individuals after Hurricane Florence. So first the hurricane happened, they lost their home. Well, then, and their car, and then they lost their job, and then their home had mold damage. So then maybe they had health issues. Now they're having financial issues. And up now it's hurricane season again, and now we're worried about it happening all over again, right? So the stressors just build up and build up and build up, and it's like you just can't manage all of them. Um, if before the stressors start happening, if we don't have as many of those resources that we talked about earlier, those personal resources, those past success experiences, that sense of self-efficacy, those connections with other people, right, then it's going to be harder for us to manage any new stressor, right? If we're just kind of barely hanging on and something new happens, right? We're not going to be able to manage it. Or if the stressor involves a lot of losses. So maybe we have all these things, but this trauma, the stressful event has really, caused us to lose those things. So a disaster happens, you have to relocate. So now you've lost all your social support and all your social resources. You've lost your economic stability because, right, you've lost your job and your material possessions. So those are the things that really can kind of bring us to that tipping point. But what's also we know, which just to get a little optimism, is we can get past that tipping point, and we see people, quite often are able to again non-linearly change into now they're able to manage it again. And that's really the big challenge, I think, in resilient science is understanding how do people get to that tipping point, get past it, and then are able to, bounce. I don't want to say bounce back, but able to, right, move again to that resilient responding. That I think is the big challenge, the big question that we really need to answer going forward.
And Dr. Littleton, I'd like to see what my wise friend Aslan said something this past weekend that hard looks different for everybody. And I've been kind of marinating on that this week as I was getting ready to facilitate this webinar because that really resonated that keeping that in mind can help us have a little more empathy for people that we feel like, they should toughen up or we should toughen up, going back to that self-compassion, right? So What do you think about that? I know I'm putting you on the spot a little. This is a question I have of, how do we sit with that hard looks different for everybody? Resilience does not look the same for everyone.
Yes, exactly. And that's really where, obviously there's some commonalities, right? If we all experienced, you know, a, a natural disaster, right, and we're affected as far as the same level of losses, right? That's probably going to be hard for everyone. But the meanings of that, of what we bring into that situation, right, it's going to vary. And so we have to really think about being resilient or going to the tipping point where you're no longer resilient is idiographic. It's unique to each person. And obviously the harder things are, the more
Mhm.
challenging they are. Probably we're going to see more similarities, but
Yeah.
right, everyone still is unique, right? Everyone enters that situation with different past, different personal strengths, different community supports that enable them to respond, either more adaptively or less adaptively in that situation to be able to be resilient and do well or not. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Um, all right. So I want to go back to you, to Noya, to talk a little. We started to kind of tap into the role of leadership and resilience a minute ago with one of our attendees' questions. But I'd love to hear from you. Let's get way more specific if we can. If you have any like very specific things or factors, characteristics that what leadership behaviors, what characteristics of leaders make them resilient, and what does resilient leadership look like in practice? If you can give us some examples.
Yeah, it's kind of a hard question, right? Because very similar to how we started off our conversation about the definition of resilience and how hard it is to kind of capture that, leadership is pretty much the same. I think I remember reading like one of my first assignment papers in my PhD program, and it was like essentially a 36-page paper of like, how do we define leadership? Well, we still don't know. So I think that, it is hard to look at sort of a one-size approach to the leadership that might be needed within an organization or the leader that's needed. I think the golden vein that I'm starting to see is building self-awareness. That self-awareness component is huge as a leader and as a follower, which if you think about it, wherever we sit, we're both leaders and followers in some capacity of our lives. And so I think that self-awareness component is a bit of the golden thread to everything, right? If you're self-aware, you're not just thinking about how you're reflecting on your interactions with people and how you respond to things and, all the things that you would think of being internal. You're also understanding and trying to navigate how you're being perceived by others. So it's an internal external exchange, right? Going back to systems, it's our like individual system going back and forth, gathering information, processing it, kicking out waste, bringing in energy, flowing things out. It's the same thing at a smaller individual level. And so when I think about all of that, if you're self-aware as a leader, you will sort of navigate into specific leadership approaches that might be needed, right? You probably didn't know as a leader going through COVID that you were most likely implementing situational leadership theory, but it was pretty situational, right? Like you had to navigate, you had to, think about your staff as one-on-one individuals being at different levels because hopefully you were listening to, where people were in dealing with everything that they might be dealing with. If an organization is going through a huge change, as a leader, you want to inspire and you want to stimulate and you want to motivate. And so maybe you're becoming more transformational in your leadership. So I think if you have that self-aware button in your life that you're consistently pressing on each day and intentionally walking towards it, I think that that's the missing link that often we don't really think about. And so as a leader going into any space, whether it's a small team or a large corporation, building that self-awareness along the way as you interact with people and really taking that internal external exchange, I believe that that would help you to build the behaviors and the practices and the approaches and in everything that you're doing within that leadership role. And so again, it's a very grayish answer because we're all unique and we're all in unique situations, leading unique people. And so I think taking that lens and shifting it more into focusing on that self-awareness component will help you to then build what's next in your leadership.
This just made me think a lot about looking inward, right? We're talking about Dr. Littleton's self-compassion and mindfulness, and you're talking about self-awareness. And Kenneth, of course, is looking at the internal things you're doing well or not. There's the organizational self-awareness through evaluation and monitoring and adaptive management. So, yeah, it's so interesting how resilience can be very similar and different, all these different levels. So we have about 10 minutes left. And it is Earth Month. So let's have a little fun with a question. I'm curious. We're gonna talk about the environment a little bit. Tanoya and Kenneth, we know each other by working on environmental issues together over a few years. That's a through line with us. And I'd love to hear really quickly, if you can, like in a minute or less, what are some patterns and things we see in nature, good or bad, that we can learn from to build resilience? Kenneth, we'll start with you.
Really quick. I would say, and I tell my students this in evolutionary biology too, it's all about diversity. Having diversity is so important for systems and for resilience. And I think that is a huge lesson that as humans can and need to take from natural systems, the importance of diversity and the need for it.
So well said. I sometimes with my students say that biodiversity is like an insurance policy for nature, for wildlife. The more diversity we have, the stronger the systems can be. And Tanoy, I know you think a lot about this metaphor, so with your consulting work, and so let's hear from you. What's something we can learn from in nature?
I think we can learn that resilience is built through tension, right? In nature, we see it all the time. You do get to a threshold, but we see ecosystems bounce back with a little bit of time and care and focus. And so, building off of what everyone said, having that grace and that compassion and that self-awareness and that understanding, processing that, reflecting it, and then moving forward just a little bit. I think nature does that so well, and it's so beautiful to see, and it's such an impactful story to see something come back. I mean, that's a lot of the reason why we are in the field that we're in, is because we want to see that sort of end goal of, something recovering or a species coming back. That's just always a great story. And so I think as we think about resilience, we can gather so much from nature and knowing that it's okay to rest in those tensions. Sometimes it's intense, sometimes it's hard, but knowing and reflecting that, there's going to be a tomorrow that we can move forward on, and having faith that as we build, we get stronger. So that would be my takeaway from ecosystems.
So many beautiful quotes. I'm just going to pull out of all of this from all three of you. It's amazing. Thank you for those words of wisdom for us. So we have a couple questions that are coming into Q&A, and I would like to ask these, and then we'll do our lightning round that you're all aware of at the end to wrap it up instead of ending on Q&A. So we're going to go to one of these questions. Heather, I think this will be a good one for you. Can you speak to how personal relationships and spirituality can support building resilience?
Yeah, so those feel like two different things. So I'm going to talk about one at a time, right? So the first one is personal relationships, right? So again, right, even though we live in an individualistic culture, we're not, right, sole individuals, right? So we really need to have connections to each other to manage challenging situations. So other people give us a sounding board, someone to help us express and process our emotions. Other people obviously can give us tangible support. So helping us out, right, when we need extra help, whether that's like with finance, taking care of family members, right? Just something simple like someone cooking a meal for you, right? When you're in need, right? We think about whenever someone has like a surgery, right? We have those meal trains where everyone like pitches in to cook a meal for each other. And then of course, in the long term, those personal relationships can build our sense of self, of efficacy, of feeling like we're more than just ourselves, that we have other people available to us if we need help. So, right, those personal relationships are really critical for building resilience, right? That's why our grit toolkit really emphasizes the importance of, forming those connections and being there for each other, right? And it's mutual, right? So other people help us and we help others. And when we help others and offer them support, it can build our sense of efficacy, right? And it just feels good to help other people. And it leads to that sense of like, I'm helping you now, and I know you'll be there for me if I need you in the future. Spirituality is a little more complex because, right, spirituality, it can be really beneficial and helpful, and it also can be associated with more negative outcomes. And that's probably because it can, be utilized in different ways. So we know that the social aspects of spirituality and religiosity are really critical, right? So our religious and spiritual communities can be really important sources of support and help when we need them. We know that having, right, certain spiritual religious values related to, right, there's a plan for this. I have something bigger than myself that is there to help and support me in that situation. So that can be really positive. And sometimes I think it's not so much that it's the spirituality, religiosity in itself is, right, potentially harmful or can undermine resilience. But sometimes when folks feel overwhelmed, that's what they turn to because, right, they feel like they don't have any other options left. We saw that with some of our hurricane survivors where it's like, I can't handle this. I don't know what to do. So I'm going to turn to my, right, religion, my spirituality. So it's not so much that it's like a problem, right? It's leading to negative outcomes, but it's associated with when you feel like you don't have anything else to turn to. Folks sometimes turn to that, and so it can make it look like it's problematic. But yeah, and of course, spirituality, religiosity is an important source of self-compassion. So that's again where it can be really on the positive side, right? But that spirituality, religious, that helps us cultivate that sense of self-compassion, is critical.
Yeah, and sometimes bringing people together if you're Black in community too, going back to your point about other people as well. I kind of seeing that as a little bit of a Venn diagram space too there in my mind. Thank you for that great question and answer. And now it's time for our, unfortunately, we won't get to all the questions today. Some great ones in the chat, but I do want to hear from each of you. We have about a minute and then we'll wrap up for today. And I'll, of course, share the panelist PDF again if you've joined us in the middle. So you can follow them along in all their amazing work. But I'd love to hear if someone watching today wanted to strengthen resilience at any scale, what's one small and meaningful action that you would suggest for them? Dr. Thompson, we'll go to you first.
That's hard for a minute, but I think I'll go back to self-awareness, really working that muscle and taking the time to pause and reflect internally, but also observe and perceive how others are watching or observing you. And so building that self-awareness in everything that you do, I believe that helps you to sort of navigate as you're getting to thresholds to recognize, okay, maybe I do need to reach out to community. Okay, maybe I do need to give myself a little bit of grace. Maybe I do need to take a pause here and rest. Or maybe I do need to push forward and get out my comfort zone just for a little bit. I know I can do it for this amount of time. So I think that is again that small golden thread that you can kind of go back to help you build resilience and build yourself towards strengthening in hard times.
Thank you, Tanoya. Beautifully said. All right, Dr. Rayner.
Thank you. Yeah, I think along similar lines, as an instructional designer, for me, one of my favorite principles that I mentioned earlier is encourage learning and experimentation. So promoting that it's okay to fail in an experiment because that's also how we learn. And even bringing that to the ecosystem, it's okay to try out different stewardship efforts around restoration and things like that, because that's how we're going to learn how to better restore those habitats and how those habitats can maintain that resilience. So I think just encourage learning and experimentation and allowing and to be able to have a safe place for that failure to occur and to learn from that failure.
Yeah, it's okay to fail. I love that permission. Some of us need to hear that more. Like me, I'm talking about myself right now. Thank you for that. All right. Last but not least, Dr. Littleton, any tips from you?
Yeah, so I would say two things. First is form connections in your community, right? Find community and form those connections, form those relationships. And the other is find things that make you feel empowered and make you feel powerful and make you feel capable and do those things because that's going to help you, have that sense that you can do hard things, that you can handle adversity when it happens.
Thank you so much for this beautiful wrap up and experience with all three of you. I'll turn over to Liz Zavadsky to close us out for today, our amazing executive director at ecochallenge.org. And thank you to our panelists for letting me grill you with many, many questions. We appreciate it so much.
Lauren, when you talked about this webinar and planning it, and you knew exactly who you wanted to invite to be on this, I was so excited just by what you shared about them with our team. And today, the three of you and Lauren, you also have just really taken us above and beyond where I thought we would go. And I'm so grateful for everything that you shared. I'm grateful for the different perspectives that you've brought to this, your expertise, your knowledge, and also your humanity in this topic. So thank you so much. We are better because of you, and I wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you for joining, everyone. We'll have a recording posted, and we appreciate all of your time. Have a great day.